as well as online. I believe we have more than 100 people for today's event, which is terrific. And we look forward to hearing questions from as many of you as possible. And if you already have questions, please start sending them through and they'll be collated and brought to Kevin through the course of the afternoon. My name is Sean Corey. I'm the CEO of the Coleman Education Foundation and Our Place. For those that might be less familiar with Our Place, it is a holistic place-based approach to supporting education, health and development of children and families in communities experiencing disadvantage by utilising the universal platform of a school. Our Place was developed from the experience at our Lighthouse site, Doveton College, and we facilitate partnerships between the school, local government, relevant government departments and service providers that enable the school to be the central place for learning and support services that overcome the barriers to education attainment from birth right through to adult. Through the Coleman Education Foundation's long-term partnership with the Victorian State Government, Our Place is being implemented in 10 school sites across Victoria over 10 years with the support of our valued philanthropic partners, many of whom are joining us online today. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank Monterey Secondary College for hosting today's event. We greatly appreciate their assistance in making the event possible, and especially enabling this to be televised online. And now I'd like to turn to our special guest for today's event and express my sincere gratitude and appreciation on behalf of Our Place for Sir Kevan Collins making the time to join us today. Kevin has a long-standing relationship with Our Place and Doveton College. He has regularly contributed his expertise and knowledge to Our Place and Doveton College as things have evolved over the past 10 years, and is one of a number of international leaders in the education sector who have helped Did that just happen or do I need to go back? Okay. Okay, we had a brief technical glitch, but we're good to go again. Yeah, okay, great. Kevin is also chair of the Youth Endowment Fund, a Home Office funded charity generating and mobilising evidence around what works to reduce youth crime and violence. Kevin has recently been appointed to the inaugural board of Australia's Education Research Organisation and currently holds the position of Vice Chair at Learning by Questions, an education technology company. Kevin also serves on the boards at Good Start Early Learning, several UK-based education charities and Cognita schools, supporting their work with more than 90 schools in 12 countries. Most recently, Kevin served as England's Education Recovery Commissioner to address the impacts on children's learning as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. So before I get to ask the first question of Kevin, I just wanted to briefly outline the format for today's event. I will start with a few questions for Kevin, but we will then pause to take some questions, and we have a couple of other topics that we'll pick up once those questions pass through. So Kevin, to kick things off, perhaps we can start with your most recent appointment as the Education Recovery Commissioner and discuss the topic that has preoccupied all of us personally and professionally over the past 2 years, the COVID-19 pandemic. What have you learned about the impact of COVID school closures in the UK?
Thank you very much, Sean, and thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this. It's It's absolutely brilliant to be back in Australia. It's almost 2 years to the day when I was supposed to be flying over and it was cancelled, and it's just been great. So I've been joining you in the middle of the night quite a lot at events, but it's quite nice to be here in the flesh. So it's just brilliant. And in a funny way, it feels like a long time, 2 years, but then every now and then it feels like nothing at all. Time has gone into a very strange sort of continuum. Victoria is a really interesting place to come and talk about COVID, because actually, of all the education systems in the world, your lockdown was probably longer than anyone else's, apart from a couple of states I know that I've worked with in India. So in England, we had on average 115 days missing in education. And what we've learned through the analysis of data in all sorts of ways, and some of it's been really good, rigorous data, is that learning loss is real. Learning loss happened. Learning loss particularly profound for the children who come from disadvantaged communities. We've also learned that it's way beyond the academics, the impact of missing education, particularly around socialization. Mental health issues are concerning us. Reported levels of anxiety in young people are concerning us. Emerging data around obesity is concerning us. So we've learned that through COVID that we didn't really need COVID to teach us, thankfully, and I hope we never have it again. We learned that schools are critical to the lives of children. Although I was appointed as the Education Recovery Commissioner, I kind of wanted, or I didn't win the argument, I wanted to really be the Recovery Commissioner. At first they wanted to call me Catch-Up Commissioner, Catch-Up Czar. And I said, there's no chance in the world that I'll do that. So I got to recovery, and then you get to, in my mind, it should have been childhood. So I think there's been an impact on childhood. I don't think the story has been written. I think it's going to take a while. And just to finish this one, I think the recovery approach needs to be broad, all children. It needs to have focus, particularly on those who have the greatest loss. And it has to be thoughtful about not only recovering, and we'll get to this later, but learning from COVID. There are some things that we learned that we would probably want to hold on to, as well as things we'd want to never see again. So there's a whole range of issues, but it's profound. It's the biggest disruption to childhood in the UK, certainly since the Second World War. And in fact, children missed less days of school in the Second World War than less in COVID.
You talk there obviously about some of the areas where the impacts have been felt, and I guess we could read into that some of the key priorities. But could you talk a little bit more about the key priorities for a successful recovery?
So I was fortunate to be given so I was appointed by the Prime Minister to do the work. And anyone, it actually, I know it got to the press in Australia when I resigned. It did end in tears, to be honest, but I always knew it would. What was I thinking of? But at that moment, you've got to stand up and do your job, and it is a national endeavour. And I think there's a huge responsibility on the grown-ups to be thinking about childhood. It's interesting. I don't know if this is true in Australia. It's interesting that there's been a massive thought about how do you recover business, how do you recover the commercial sector, how do you how do you weigh in with furlough or for salaries for people? All correct, but I'm not quite sure we've had the same level of attention to childhood. So that was why I stood up to the work. And when we did and I got a very good, brilliant team of people around me, from a team from the education department, a team from universities, mainly from Cambridge, and a team from private sector, from Boston Consulting. And I was grateful to have all these insights. And when you look at the evidence, of course, there's not really a parallel, but so you look at the evidence of long-term disruptions in education. I'll give you one. In the 70s, there was a strike in Belgium of teachers who were Flemish, but not the French speakers. And then when you track the children, there was about a year long, that strike. And when you track the children through life later, there was an impact on their own personal earnings, having been the children whose teachers were on strike. Same story when you look at the disputes in Argentina over the long term. So we had enough evidence to tell us that if you don't recover properly, it has a long-term impact on the earnings of the individual and obviously then on the economy of the country. So some people, like the United States, the Netherlands, responded to that data and allocated to each school a large sum of money to recover from COVID. The Netherlands is about £1,300. So what's that? Getting on for $2,000, I suppose, per child extra to the recovery. States again, the same amount of money. So you need resources, and what you need them for to recover. I think I ended up with the 3 T's. Classic sort of way of making it sort of ring in the media and that. So the 3 T's were an investment in teaching, because our teachers may have faced children and needs that they weren't in their normal repertoire of teaching. I'll give you a good example. We think there are about 80,000 more children going into year 7, the first year of high school, not reading the expected level. And we need to make sure the expertise on teaching literacy is really strong in our secondary schools. Otherwise, we know that if you don't arrive at secondary school at the right level of reading, we know what happens to you over time. The probability of succeeding is very low. So we need to invest in teaching. Year 1 teachers will need support to adapt their teaching for the missed play that reception children missed in reception. We all need to think about adjusting our curriculums in order to make sure that we're meeting the priorities of the times that were missed. So teaching is a big one. The second, and Victoria has picked this one up, the second is tutoring. The evidence is really strong that high quality, well-targeted tutoring can have effect, and particular effect on disadvantaged children, actually. So investing in tutoring and making sure that's provided, and it's great to see that the school I was at this morning had tutoring going on for lots and lots of children. And the third for me was time. And time was, and this might not go down well with the teachers in the room, my proposal was, although the unions were on board in England, I wanted to extend school day by about half an hour in primary and an hour in secondary, so that you could do more social community activities, basically. More sport, more drama, more art, more of the wider stuff. And I wanted to build that in and fund all that and have an extended school experience for children to catch up from those things they'd missed. So the 3 T's were a solution, and the evidence kind of was behind all of them, I think.
Thanks, Kevin. You talked there about the impacts on children facing disadvantage. Can you talk a little bit more about the particular impacts that were observed in the work that you did?
So, unfortunately, as actually with everywhere in the world, there is a strong correlation between your family's wealth and your family's education outcomes and your child's outcomes. This is a sort of profound problem. If you dig down from the NAPLAN results, which on average indicated no impact through COVID, you go down the next layer, you'll see significant variation by family wealth and by family education, using that as the proxy. That's true everywhere in the world. And growing education inequality is one of our, as educators globally, I think probably the biggest issue we face. We've learned a lot about how to teach children well. We know more about it. Teaching is better. Education is better than it's ever been. It's just not great for everyone. And so the question is, how do you make sure the promise of education is delivered to every child? And this is it. It's always been important, but it's increasingly important in a world where knowledge and the knowledge economy drives opportunity. And unfortunately, if you fall out of education in, I hate to use this language, but in the bottom 20%, because of the growing automation in economy, the hollowing out of the economy, it becomes increasingly difficult to bridge the divide and move into the life of real opportunity and wealth. So education inequality and education outcomes are priorities for me, and proportionate and overwhelmingly it's aligned to the family you're born to, unfortunately, and their wealth. And we need to tackle that issue. We haven't really conquered the question of what is the pedagogy that delivers better equality of opportunity and outcomes for all children. It's still geared very much to what you might call the Route 1 kids. They're going to go well at primary, well at secondary, into university. It all works pretty well for that group. It doesn't work well for the other group. And it matters because historically, United States, Australia, UK, there was a kind of place to go. There was work, and it was pretty good work, but there was work. Where I come from the north of England, from Preston. I'm a boy of family of 6 boys. It was clear if you weren't going to university, like I was the only one of my brothers that went to, if you weren't, there was work, there were places to go, and they do that kind of work. Not anymore in Preston, not anymore. Equally, not anymore if you go to parts of, you go to Dalton in the States, or you go to parts of Australia that you'll know better than I. So how do you find ways into the knowledge economy? Education is the promise. and yet we're not yet good enough at educating all of our children well enough. So that's why I obsess about disadvantage. That's why it's my kind of driving, after 40 odd years of this work, this is why it's my driving kind of passion.
Mm. One of the things you mentioned in your opening comments was that there have been a lot of things that we've learned or been forced to learn or innovate around because of the pandemic that we should latch onto or look to, make sure we don't lose those things. Could you talk about some of those?
So, yeah, there's a couple that I think I'd like to mention. One of the things you read out was I'm very interested in technology and education. I don't believe that, unlike other industries, technology has really disrupted education yet. There's been lots of promise. There's been lots of equally. There's been lots of kit in cupboards that has gathered dust and not been used. There's been lots of wasted money. There's lots of fad and fashion. One thing that has happened, I think, through the pandemic is that we've seen both the best and the worst of the prospects of technology. So it's become, we've moved into a new place. I think the way that teachers pivoted to do online learning was astonishing and hasn't received the kind of praise it should. It was remarkable what's happened around the world. I've joined online lessons with children, their parents, as far and wide as Sao Paulo and Glasgow, and it is amazing to see how that has happened. And I think there's some learning there that we want to hold on to. There's a new blended opportunity, and I think that's going to be captured. I hope that's going to be captured. But we've also seen the digital divide. We've seen, and one of the reasons of the growing inequality through COVID is that those that had it and parents knew how to use it and had full access to it and had not only the device but good connectivity and the rest of it, they were able to take that advantage and move with it, and others weren't. So how do you make sure the resources, it's got to become as universal and as ubiquitous as any other core resource. Every child has got to have access to technology. It's going to be fundamental to succeed, in my view. And so in the UK, we gave out well over 1 million laptops, the government, to families. You're going to lose some aren't going to come back. Some, get over it. We're going to work that. That's got to be how it's done. That's just going to be a requirement. So I think that we've got opportunities with it. We haven't yet really broken it in the classroom. I still think that teachers are doing far too much mundane tasks that could be done by technology. Teachers spend a lot of time marking things that are correct when it could just be done simply and direct their attention to where misconceptions and misunderstandings are. Early years, we're beginning to, I think, learn more and more about this. I know the work I do at Good Start, we're doing a global thought leaders piece this year with thinking about what's the best we know about the using technology in the early years. It's different and we need to think about it differently, but these children are born tech savvy. It is becoming part of their lives in nature. They're not learning it. This is how it's woven in. So I think it's going to be really interesting in the next 20 years. I think this is probably going to be there's been very few watershed moments in education, really mass education. Classrooms, aren't that different from they were in Victorian era, really. There's an expert at the front, a load of young people, little people over there. But technology is going to change that in very profound ways, I think. The second is the work of parents. Now, the research has, for 25 years, been consistent that the more involved a parent is in their child's learning, the more successful the child will be. There is a very clear research base that involvement of parents is positive for children. What's always been difficult is to not know that, but to work out how do you get parents involved. That's always been the trick. COVID has shown us, again, maybe it's necessity invention, mother invention. We suddenly saw many more parents leaning in and having to. Now, we don't want that as much, but there's something to hold on to there. As many parents who said, I can't wait. Actually, this is quite interesting, being involved in my child's education and their learning. I've learned more about it. How do weave parents become genuine partners in the learning? Because we know it makes a big difference. And I don't mean doing the work. I just mean maintaining an engagement, knowing that it's important, demonstrating that to their children, and being part of the learning learning approach. So the legacy of technology and the legacy of parents' roles, I think, is something we should think about and harness and capture.
Yeah, we would absolutely agree with you, the importance of parents being involved in children's learning. And would you think that's another, challenge that children in disadvantaged settings have faced, where parents maybe don't have the as much ability, or the challenge of online learning and the lack of technology or skills potentially as
Well, it's never. I don't think it's a challenge of kind of desire.
No.
Whenever you and this work's been done, whenever you survey parents at the birth of a child, people are ambitious for their child. They this is the most treasured thing in their life, and of course they're ambitious for that child. But a whole set of things kick in that make it harder for you to be engaged. Sometimes it's the fact that schools and educators and all of us, we just start using language which scares people. We start making it more complicated than it needs to be. People's lives become a bit more chaotic and demanding, and they can't find the space and time. We create sort of a set of, here are the rules, and if you don't join with us in our rules, well, then you're not in. And then equally, some people who have very traumatic education experiences themselves are really nervous about getting involved. So I'll give you a quick story if I can. I got so interested in this when I was the chief exec of the Education Endowment Foundation. For those that don't know, we essentially were lucky to have a kind of a big slug of money from the government, and we raised a lot of money. And our job was to experiment, if you like, with approaches in education to test genuinely whether they work or not. And we could use randomized controlled trials, a kind of medical model. We could do mixed methods, could do a whole range of things, the kind of work that Aero in Australia is hopefully going to be doing. And one of the questions was, how do you get parents involved? So, and you might not like the idea, right? But you just kind of go with this. I'm going to follow the evidence and see where it takes me. I'm going to put my ideology to one side, and I'm just going to go with the evidence. So the idea was you just pay parents money to buy their time. So you said to parents, and this is following on from a study done in Chicago that worked. We said to the parents, we're going to give you a voucher that you can spend kind of in any aisle you like in the supermarket. We're not going to check that, as long as you come to engage in parents' learning, because we know parents' learning classes are highly correlated to child's progress. And I was in a city called Middlesbrough in the northeast of England, old industrial city. And I was in the room with the head teacher, and we were talking about the parents who wouldn't do it. So she very kindly, Sarah, the head teacher, she very kindly agreed to take me to meet one of the parents. So I go around to the house with Sarah, and what's important, I'm not just saying this for effect, is when I go into the house, there's nothing chaotic at all. It's absolutely spotless. Tea and a saucer, cup, the works, okay? And I say to the mother, out of interest, why aren't you using the voucher and coming to the parent class? She says, I haven't got time, too busy. I say, I completely understand. Thank you very much. Blah, blah, another biscuit. And then I leave, okay? And then I talk to the head teacher later, because it's not my job to kind of quiz people. And she says, well, that parent does have 2 children. They're both at my school right now, and she doesn't work. So then I'm trying to work out, so why are you too busy? And then we send in proper people, unlike me, who do the qualitative research, which is always really important after the quantitative research, to talk to the parent and get the story behind the numbers. But you need the numbers as well as the story, by the way. And she explains that her own life at school was so awful, and she came out with no qualifications, and she was trying to be the best mother she could be, and she thought maybe the parent class was into us indicating she wasn't a good mother. And she was too frightened to go to the school for all sorts of reasons. She didn't want to go back into a classroom. So then you go, okay, we're going to move the parenting class to a new venue. We're going to put them in pubs in the day and in community centres and all that kind of stuff. You try and work around. But the research gives you the chance to understand the barriers and to try and find the solutions and to try and work round. So I think these insights are the really important thing, because everybody around the world is working really, really hard to try and deal with this issue of access, of inequality. And it's not that we aren't thinking of things to do. It's just we have to just keep working through at a fairly granular level what's the next turn of the screw? What's the next thing we can learn? This, what you're doing, what your colleagues are doing, this is hard work. If we knew how to do it, if the easy answers were obvious, we'd all do it tomorrow. And you're not alone. Everybody is working through these really, really pressing questions. And the research is really helping, in my view.
You talked earlier about, well, we've talked about the impacts of COVID on children's learning, and you touched on the importance of the social aspects. And I'm wondering if you could talk about how COVID has had an impact and why those social activities are important in a child's education journey.
Well, I guess this is my point about childhood, really, Sean. And I think often you go to one age group or another. But if I asked you all in the room who have children, I bet you whatever age they are, from 0 through to late teenagers, there would be an impact on their childhood and their growing up from COVID. Now, whether they've not been able to sing in a choir, play competitive sport, go out and hang out with their mates as teenagers and learn what life's really about and develop their self-identity and all the stuff around that and sexuality and all that, which isn't done across the dinner table, it's done with your mates at that age, for example, or early years, you haven't played with each other, with other young children in toddlers groups, so you haven't been in a language environment with other kids. At every point in childhood, I think there's been impact. And the legacy of that, I've said it already, and I don't mind saying it again, I think is on your social and personal development as well as on your cognitive development. Now, a piece of work that I've just finished with UNESCO on what's called reimagining education. It's working up to the United Nations review of their education policy. We gathered 240 scientists from 45 countries, and I was very honoured to chair the commission for UNESCO. We've just published the report. It's really interesting to read, actually, because what it's presenting is that defining the success of whatever we do as grown-ups in children's lives needs to be considered again, and we're using the language of our children flourishing. So a flourishing child is the goal. And lots of education systems and lots of governments around the world have quite rightly to this day, under the UN Charter actually, have measured enrollments at school and outcomes in literacy and numeracy as the key indicators of the success of an education system. And what we're beginning to realize, and a lot of us have kind of developed that and tweaked it, but essentially quite a lot of it goes back to that stuff. And not for Australia and the UK, but the money from the UN flows to countries to build those outcomes for children. And what we're realizing is that if that's all you measure around the world, the data tells us that actually we've been successful in those things, but they're not actually happier. Some of the other indicators tell us of levels of depression, of mental health issues, of alienation are actually growing in childhood. And equally, so the outcomes aren't really delivering the happiness we want for, or the flourishing we want for our children. Equally, when you gather the scientists, what was interesting about this bit of work is it was multidisciplinary. We had pediatricians, we had anthropologists, we had cognitive scientists, we had geneticists, we had an amazing array. And we learned that when you really understand what's going on in the development of the mind and of the body, and we know more about the brain than we've ever known, it's a holistic process. Unless the child is flourishing, they're not ready to learn. They're not able to learn. If that, all this work from the trauma stuff that many of you are involved in. But the science is really back. This isn't a kind of nice to have now. This isn't a kind of theory. This is the science is telling us that holistic education addressing the broad child is actually the way you get the best outcomes in any which way you want to measure it. So that's why I'm interested in the way COVID has impacted not only on catching up the reading loss, which we need to do, no question, but we also need to address, when we can really understand it, what the other losses are, what the other implications are. Now, we shouldn't go charging in on that, by the way. I think we need to talk to children. I don't think the story's been told. I think we need to listen to our children. They all have their own stories about COVID. Some not so much in Australia, but you have got this in Australia. But in some places, it's loss in the family. It's grieving. It's a whole. We need to really listen to them in order to make sure that our programs and our approach meets the experience they had. But it's definitely, in my view, a social, emotional, and cognitive campaign, if you like, or agenda.
Thanks, Kevin. I think that's enough questions from me for the minute. Maybe we can see if there are some questions in the room or online.
I'm also really keen for people to challenge me, because, you know, it's not yet, I don't know, you know, a lot of this is about, it's unfolding the story. So there'll be other kind of perspectives and stories to tell, and it's really important we hear each other's on that.
Do we have a question? I think so.
Well, you do that side and I'll do this side.
I think they can't see us.
Oh, okay.
Kevin, just expanding on what you said, I'm interested in what then do schools need to do? What do we need to do? So the traditional school focus, as you said, and if we're really talking about children flourishing, where does early childhood fit into that? And what is it that we actually need to do now in schools?
So rather than jumping to the actual activities, I still think the first thing, this is a big piece of work that when I first got the role in England as the Recovery Commissioner, in the first term, the resources were allocated to really involve yourself in diagnostic assessment. Just take a moment to really work out what the issues are and what the needs are, and talk to the children. And so the broad sense of diagnostic assessment. And I'm beginning to think, June, that we've got better tools now to look at some of the non-academic development of our children as well. So, you know, we know that, let's take something like self-regulation, hugely important area of development. It is measurable. And therefore, we should start asking that question. So, as you know, we're doing some work in Good Start settings here in Victoria, using something like Toolbox, as with children as young as 3, as they play games and we gather data on their development, whether it's in non-academic as well as academic development. So I think diagnostic assessment, so we can act, not so we can. We're good at summative assessment. I don't, you know, do all that stuff, but that's not. It's information that allows me as the adult to act with the children in front of me to make better decisions. So I think assessment is key, and better diagnostic assessments. The second, I think, is making sure, and we do this already, I'm sure, in all of our schools, that the justification for a broad and rich curriculum is getting stronger and stronger. The broad and rich curriculum creates a range of experiences. And one of the tendencies when you have these sort of crises is to narrow curriculum in order to drive through the high priority areas. So I know what we need to do. Let's double down on reading. Now, there's a risk if you do that, because you begin to deny the broad experience, which for some kids is what motivates them to be involved and engaged. Absenteeism rates in our schools in the UK at the moment, post-COVID, are double what they were before COVID. I know that absence rates in Australia are high as well. So we need to find a way of deeply engaging children to be motivated to be at school. And often there's a bit of a contract about the stuff I really love, and then I'll do the stuff that I know you want me to do. Now, we have got kids who love doing the stuff we really want them to do, but we've got other kids who really can't wait for double PE, or really can't wait for that bit of the day. But that's part of the covenant. And the covenant has actually been slightly challenged, you know, the idea that you go every day, the idea, in a broad terms, we've said that you don't need to go every day. We've stopped you coming every day. So we have to rebuild the covenant, why you have to come every day, the relationship of being there. So I think it's about making sure that we take time to learn and listen, making sure we go back to making sure that school is a place where you genuinely are excited to be there and you have the joy of that. And the experience is rich and broad in order to give every child a potential point of really, really their love point. And then making sure that when we've got the data information, we're able to vary our offer to meet the needs. And that will mean tutoring. It may mean a bit more of this and a bit more of that to catch them up. Because I do think you need to, you know, don't take what I'm saying wrong. We have to achieve in the core to thrive, but it's about how you get there.
questions online.
I've got a question. Just in relation to, as you've alluded, and something that we're certainly very focused on here in schools post the COVID and probably pre-COVID as well, is around the wellbeing and health and mental health of young people, right? Which is probably already an issue, and it's been compounded with COVID, and I'm sure it's the same over there. I'm interested if there's been any strategies in a response to that that's not just that reactive, well, we'll get some more counsellors, and we know that those are thin on the ground, and so we've got this challenge around how we're going to respond to that. So I'm just interested in the UK, have you sort of developed any sort of broad scope, not just reactive ways to sort of help improve that?
So you've got the classic government response, we're going to put a mental health worker in every school. Okay. And of course, how can you say that's not a good thing? But the risk is, of course, what you've done is essentially outsource the problem. So I just want to be clear and put some tiers in here. If you think about mental health issues of children, and classically, I don't know how you do it in Australia, but we put it in a kind of hierarchy. And there's 4 tiers in the hierarchy. And in the first tier, it's a kind of, what do you do in the universal lives of children to create resilience? So that when they face a challenge which can knock you across into a mental health issue, you've got more of a chance to be able to have something to draw on to see you through that moment. Then in the second tier, you've usually got, actually in the school, we need a resource to support this child. Third tier, we actually need to go out of the school and get some support from our local child and mental health services. Fourth tier, it's a really difficult, complex medical issue. Psychiatrist needs to lead the provision. At the first tier, the universal bit, I think it's really important that everyone in school understands that the mental health of their children, the well-being of their children is their business. And taking you back to the broad curriculum, there are certain contributions that different subjects can make. So if you take something like teenage, I'll do a personal thing. In my teenage life, reading certain novels and being deeply interested in English as a subject really helped me understand myself and where I was in the world. You know, Graham Greene, I read to know I'm not alone. So there are certain subjects that make a contribution to your own personal resilience and development. For many kids, PE is super important. So I think we need to not outsource it all the time. And it takes me back to the value of the broad and rich curriculum. The second thing I'd say is that when you start digging into well-being, you begin to ask the question, well, what does it really mean in terms of education? And I keep coming back to metacognition, knowledge of self and knowledge of task. You can define it like that. We know it's highly correlated to education attainment. And metacognition is absolutely something you can attend to as a teacher in subjects. So I know that in some schools in the UK, the question is, what are you doing to address the development of metacognition in your children through science as opposed through something like drama? And so you can have that conversation as a school. I think, so I think metacognition is key, self-regulation, delayed gratification is key. Of course, the best way to build delayed gratification, self-reg, play is an essential experience to learn how to regulate your gratification, because if you don't, no one will play with you, because you won't take turns. So you're beginning to unravel what is it we do in schools and early year settings that in the universal provision builds resilience and mental health sort of strength. So that's how we've gone about it. Yes, we've got the mental health worker in every school, but let's not think that solves the problem. It's actually about what we do. And the reason I guess you go back to the core, being at school in and of itself is a great way. Schooling is good for children. You know, we've doubled the number of people in the UK that home educate. Now, I'm not going to knock those people, but being with other children is really important for children. And I'll say one other thing about it. Sorry, I don't know if I'm going on too much, but you can classically think about childhood in three spaces, and you probably know this stuff that's pretty well evidenced. And the first space, of course, is with your family. The most enduring and important teachers in your life are your family and your parents. And you probably may have had too much of that first space in the last 2 years, but that first space. The second space, of course, is being in the care of a trusted adult. Second space. The third space is being alone with other children, going out and testing boundaries, being annoying as a teenager. We now call them gangs or whatever, but going exploring the world and being free. That third space, pre-COVID actually, is being squeezed out of children's lives, where you just explore the world, you test it out. The reason you do it in groups, by the way, in gangs, is because that becomes that's your next bit of security. So I worry that COVID has created a kind of an increase in that sense of fear of being out with control. And we need, if anything, in modern industrial. To make sure that we keep the third space up and open. But you probably, there's some people in the room as old as me. You can remember our childhoods, and just think about our childhoods now compared to. If I ever said to my dad I was bored, he would actually say, "What's that got to do with me? Get out." Now I look at my think about my own. Actually, I'll do my own. I suddenly, if someone said that to me, a child, I think, oh, I've got to do something. I've got to organise something. So I'm really interested in that space. I think it's really important, and COVID might have exacerbated it a bit.
Oh, and then online.
Kevin, you're bringing up the concept of risk averse, the idea that parents are risk averse. Systems seem to be really risk averse at the moment. COVID just reinforced that. Our NAPLAN data didn't seem to be such a bad outcome. In fact, it was quite good in many places, and yet quite average, absolutely. So the learning seemed to take place if the assessment does that. So how do you balance the risk averse with the need to give kids latitude to explore, as you're talking about?
I can get up. In early years, this is a huge issue, that people. So you keep all these registers of, Johnny hurt his arm, do a form, fill it in. So how do you allow for what you might call risky play, intentional, planned, risky play? Crucial, important. Do we really want, you can make children super safe. You can put them in a seat and say, never move. Of course, but the trouble with that kind of notion of safety is what you don't know is the damage you're doing to their mind. So what we need to do is, all of us, in a sense, slightly grow up on this and understand that risk is part of life, and we need to build it and plan for it. Of course, we need to take care. But I'm like you, I think from the end, what you were implying, Greg, that I worry that we take risk out and we make life smaller. So we need to be sensible about it. But I know, on the other hand, something goes wrong. He does fall, being serious now, she does fall off that tree she was climbing, and she does break her arm, and then the world crashes down on you. And therefore, no wonder you say, right, no one's climbing trees anymore. So this is a conversation we probably have, yes, with each other as educators, but we have to have much broader with a community. It's hard to do. I remember I used to, as Director of Children's Services in East London, I used to present the data to parents often and say, do you know what we've known for the last 30 years? The most dangerous place for a child is actually in the home. And you know what we've known for 30 years? That the number of people that harm children and children who are harmed hasn't actually changed in Northern Europe that much. And yet, if you ask people the question without giving them the data, they believe that stranger danger outside is a place to be frightened of, and there's this growing kind of perception, and of course the belief that the world is something you can now completely control. So I don't have an answer, but I have a fear that we're getting the risk averse is kind of curtailing childhood.
We have an online question.
Kevin, we've had a request online, I guess, to hear you proposing a lot of interesting ideas and innovations, but people would be keen to hear of examples where you're seeing some of these innovations in practice from your work and research in other education systems that give you hope or that you think are interesting for others to learn from.
Yeah, of course, I am hopeful. Actually, generally, I think things are generally moving in a very positive direction. So I think, for example, the work that's been done, and I'm not just saying this, I'm here, but the decision here in Victoria to, I know there's some wrinkles in it, but the decision here in Victoria to open up access to early education and provide funding for that, I think is probably one of the most important education developments in Australia for a long, long time. And I just generally hope other people will follow it, because and across the world, the shift in early education and its relationship to schools in our time, looking at June now, has been a transformation, and it is growing around the world very, very quickly. And I think that is a really positive sign for childhood, particularly because what we know about the evidence is that great high quality early learning is particularly beneficial for disadvantaged children. If you want to narrow the gap, you can't do it without attending to that issue. I'll stay with Australia a moment. If you really want to deal with this obsession your media have with PISA, you're not going to deal with it unless you deal with the drag and lag of the inequality issue. You've got to get the bottom up if you're going to deal with that issue. You can't do it just by pulling the top even further. So and that's hopeful that this investment's going in, this change is going into early years. I also think that it's hopeful that when you look at schools, the insights we have, the science we have, the knowledge we have about good practice is out of step from where it was when I first started training to teach, which were then pretty much some good grand theorists, but pretty much dominated by the ideology of the person who was training you to teach. No reference to empirical research. I just don't like that. So I'm not going to tell you about it. And I think we've now got much stronger empirical evidence about what works and what doesn't in education. I don't know how close to go to the edge of the water here, but so I've mentioned it already. But if you take something like the phonics debate, to me it's a kind of slightly arid debate. The evidence is fairly strong, more than fairly strong actually, that good, high quality, if you want all children to learn to read, that's your aim, to get as many children to learn to read as possible, high quality, well taught phonics instruction is an essential but not sufficient part of a reading learning program. Essential but not sufficient. You also need great comprehension, you need great attention to rhyme and syntax, you need a whole range of things. But we know that the efficient way of getting more and more kids to read, particularly in disadvantaged communities, to make sure that's part of their repertoire, that they can conquer that relationship between these 26 shapes and these 44 sounds. Teach it quick, teach it efficiently, teach it in a fun way, and get it subterranean so they can do the interesting stuff. So, and I think that's pretty well evidenced, even if I didn't want it to be. I think that's pretty well evidenced. So I think more and more teachers are willing to put their personal kind of belief system to one place and say, actually, I'll follow the evidence. I don't know about you, but if I go to the dentist, I much prefer one that says, this is the way that I've been taught to do it, rather than I was taught that, but I prefer doing it like this. So it's that for me. So I think the evidence is stronger. And then I think the final one that makes me hopeful, and the example is the increasingly the attention people are making to the group of kids who aren't going to university. The work which people around the world are trying to do are looking at good vocational education, linking work to, these are older children who are making sure they're prepared for work, they've got the right training. It's harder to do, actually, and we're not there, but that's the one that people are now attending to. And by the way, on the global stuff I do, let's remember that more children than ever in the history of mankind and womankind go to school and are educated. So, and that has dramatically changed around the world. One country I work with is, I'll give you one country I work with is India. And when I first started working with India, they were publishing something called the Right to Education Act. And that was to guarantee that every child in India had a school within a mile of where they live. That required India to build 1.1 million schools. Now, if I tell you, if you take Australia, the UK, Canada, New Zealand, English-speaking kind of systems, put them all together, we probably have 100,000 schools. That they built 1.1 million schools. That's a kind of moment of human history. So yeah, of course I'm hopeful.
Kevin, you talked about the importance of early years. One of the projects that you've been involved with Our Place, and Professor Jane Bertrand, early years expert based in Canada, has been a continuity of learning work that you've been doing. Do you want to just talk a little bit about that and how that is important in a child's development and how that can support?
Yeah. So for a long time, there's been moments of sharp transition in children's experience. And when you measure the data, that the transition points are moments when particularly the disadvantaged child can fall back. They find that those harsh transitions difficult. So with Jane and June's here and Fiona, we were trying to ask the question, what does the evidence tell you about when you create a smoother continuity in experience? And it's quite strong, and especially the work Jane's done in Toronto. And when you get a bit deeper on it, what does that really mean? And I think there are three things quickly. There is obviously a sort of sense of you passing on better information. The assessment allows you to build from the child. So you're passing on information you respect from each other. You're not saying, thank you very much for that document, I'm going to put that away and never read it. Or I'm going to test the kid myself and I'll decide, which is what a lot of people might have done. So I don't really trust you, which you teach in early years. Likewise, a year 7 teacher would say, I don't trust you because you're a primary school teacher. So building professional trust of not only what you do, but the information you give me, so I can build straight away from the child and not go back. Because if you've got expectations, of course, the other issue is around the world, and I hate to say this, but as a child presents and the more you know about their family, teachers, by and large, drop their expectations of a child based on the family's education and wealth. So we have lower expectations. So you've got to keep challenging low expectations with information. So continuous learning is about, let's build a culture where you genuinely trust me, you respect what I'm giving you, and you build from that. Equally, you don't only trust the information I give you, you trust that the experience I was giving the child was the right experience. And you're going to take that experience and you're going to build from it. And it's not going to be a kind of sharp drop. And the work that we've done in the document that is available says that at the root of that is a shared understanding and theory about learning. That we understand that these are important concepts in learning, that children are able to, it's important that children do things over and over again. They practice because that builds fluency and control. We know that. So, but in early years, that might look like this activity. It moves towards this activity, but we know the root is back to this bit of learning theory. We know that you can't overload children. Cognitive load is an important concept. We know we share that understanding. And therefore, in my practice, that's why I organize my room like this and do this in the experience. And that's why it moves towards this. Because there has to be a shift in the experience for the child. We're not saying it stays the same, but the continuity of learning is that shift is kind of building as the child develops and matures. But it roots in the same shared theory of learning. And I don't think we've had enough discussion about what's our theory of learning because the evidence is now clearer that we can begin to land on some of those important points. So continuity of learning is also about continuity of the grown-ups having a shared language and understanding to build a more seamless and appropriate experience for the children.
We have one more online question, and then I think we'll take a 3-minute break just so Kevin can grab a mouthful of water. And
And just noting that Jane Bertram is online as well at the moment. So yes. We have a question here from Matthew Cox asking Kevin for your thoughts on the role of teachers in supporting social and emotional well-being and challenging behaviours in the classroom versus the kind of specialist additional assistance that's sometimes called in for that.
What was the name of the person again? Right, so it's a great question, isn't it, from Matthew? And maybe what hopefully we already knew, but it's been underscored in our communities, is that it turns out that teachers and schools have a huge role to play in developing the behaviour and the attitudes of our children, because we have seen this reported growth, haven't we, in inappropriate behaviours and habits. So that's why, as we think about recovery after diagnostic assessments, I think focusing on habits of learning is your next priority. So an interesting piece of research came out last year on attention. So this is when you, a great example, 1, 2, 3, eyes on me. Okay, we've all said that, haven't we? Probably. That is a call for attention. And when the research started looking at the children who were able to then turn from what they were doing and attend to the educator, highly correlated to children who made more progress. So they're able to shift their attention from this activity, however engrossing, because you are calling them to attention. Now, you don't want to do that very often, but it's an interesting indicator. It's a learning habit. And it's a habit which, when you've spent a long time looking at a screen, this is into the schools, for example, and your camera's off and no one really knows if you're properly attending, is lost. So it's the learning habit we need to rebuild. When you want routines in your classroom that make learning efficient for other people, these are habits you need to re-establish. So no apology for the requirement to create habits of learning, which make the collective act more efficient. Because for a little while it's been a personal act. And we need to kind of get back to what needs to happen efficiently for all of us. So it is about the teacher, and you can't outsource that to anybody else. Because you do that in a way often, I don't like it being like rituals that everyone has to do it exactly the same way personally. This is about how I do it. My personality comes into this. But as long as my children are able to do, behave is not, I'm not afraid of the word, behave in a way that is supporting learning, I'll get to that point, and that's what I need to see in a classroom of a teacher in my school, for example, in my own teaching. Now, you will have, to the point made, some children who go beyond that, and you are going to need extra support for them. And then you obviously work with specialists on that. And there are people who are real experts on that, and I would really advise that we engage them in our schools, especially now. But it's interesting that the work done on, say, Berry Street and the trauma is really that there's lots of information, there's lots of advice we can build into our school. But I do think habits of learning is more important right now if they're just returning than straight into skills. And then I'd go on, because you'll see people ploughing on with the skills, and what they're actually doing half the day is having to redress poor habits. And as we all know, when they first come in, when you first get a class in the beginning of a year, it's worth spending a bit of time just to get those habits really, really clear and consistent, as they clear the decks and allow you to teach. There's nothing worse, is there, in my view, than really poor behaviour in a school. It makes everyone unsafe, and you certainly don't learn. So you've got to get those things in place, and they've got to be well established and secure.
thanks, Kevin. We might just take literally a 3-minute break, allow Kevin to grab a drink, and yeah, if anyone needs to take a break, step outside. We'll start again in 3 minutes.
No, I'm all right. Thank you.
Okay, well, welcome back. I think we'd like to just shift the discussion a little bit, Kevin. I mean, you've worked for quite some time in one of the UK's largest charities, the Education Endowment Fund, as CEO. You've also worked in government and with government over a long period of time. Be very interested in your thoughts around the role of philanthropy and how philanthropy and government can work together to achieve better education outcomes for all children.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. So when you work, as colleagues do in the room and online, when you work within government systems, there's a whole set of kind of obligations and incentives around your work. and you're bound, aren't you, by a set of different kind of parameters and obligations. What's interesting about philanthropy and bringing new players to the market, if you like, is that you can have more disruption and innovation. I think it's really important you don't just try and do more of the same, because often it's not, and of course the heads won't like me saying this, and the leaders of the centres, it's not just about the money. You know, it's no good. We don't want philanthropy that is sort of random acts of kindness. I'm coming to give you, you know, down to you a few extra dollars. It's, of course, money's great, but the answer is very, very rarely solved by just throwing a bit more money at it. You need innovation, you need disruption, you need new ways of working. And that's where philanthropy is at its best, when it frees you up. So the example I gave you of funding the parent study in the way that we did, that could only be done by philanthropic funding. You can just imagine the media were all over the question straight. Who's paying for this? Who's giving these parents the money? We said, don't worry, it's not public money. It happens to be this person here, and he's just decided to fund it. So it allows you to just test things and do things and innovate in ways that you can't because of the parameters around public funding. And I think that's helpful, and it allows us to innovate and find out new stuff. So the first is that it needs to be not more of the same. It needs to be disruptive. The second is that there's an absolute obligation that the legacy of philanthropic funding, pardon me, the legacy is knowledge as well as activity. There's no good somebody just throwing some money at something and walking away. You have to have a legacy of knowledge, because that gives you the prospect of us learning so that governments potentially can pick things up, because scaling doesn't happen usually through philanthropy. It happens when it becomes part of policy and picked up. And the other reason that you have to have evaluation is because you can do harm. You mentioned in your early introduction that I chair what's called the Youth Endowment Fund. Now there we've got a couple of £100 million, and we're trying to explore what works and what doesn't in preventing young people between the ages of 10 and 16 getting involved in youth violence and crime. And so we've done the same old thing we did in EEF. We've reviewed all the international evidence. We've created a toolkit. We've looked at all the potential interventions. And, you know, we found that some of the things that people do actually create more prospects that you'll get involved in crime, and they think they're doing a nice thing. So I'll give you an example of that one just while we're here. A program called Scared Straight. I'm really worried about this boy. He's 14. He's hanging out with the wrong kid. You know what we'll do? We're going to take him to a prison, and we're going to show him how horrible it is. It's called Scared Straight, and then he'll never want to do it again. This has been tried lots of times, particularly in America. Turns out that the outcome is that you're more likely to get involved in crime. Story behind the numbers. It wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be. 2, I want to be one of those guys. That was the, you know, so it's interesting. You have to learn. So philanthropy has an obligation to innovate, to leave a legacy of knowledge, to make sure it's doing no harm and not just random acts of kindness. And the third is to have strong relationships with the state or with the local kind of organizations, so that the prospect of scaling is on the agenda. Because there's the other thing that's not, I think, is not ethical, is to do good things, but only do them there and never work out or consider how am I going to make an opportunity for everybody. So there's a lot, and it's emerging. But Australia, you know, increasingly is a country it's a wonderful country and with amazing wealth actually, and there are increasingly Australians of very, very high wealth who want to do good things in Australia. And there are some fantastic, huge philanthropic charities in Australia, actually, which, if you do it on pro rata, rival things like Gates, actually, the amount of money that is being spent. So there is a resource here that people want to spend on improving and developing the lives of children in Australia. And it's how do you organise it? And I mean, we should know our place is generously supported in that way, and that's wonderful. But how do you kind of learn from that?
Could you talk a little bit more about that specific relationship between philanthropy and government to achieve that scaling that you talk about, to have the best chance of success, what advice would you say give to philanthropy and government as working together in that ambition?
Well, in the end, it's kind of all about relationships, isn't it? It's all about trust and appreciation. But underneath that, you need to get into the world of clear transparency, a shared appreciation of what the goals are, clarity of milestones and outcomes, good governance, honesty in the transition and in the transaction and the relationships. But it all boils down, as ever, it all boils down to the quality of the relationships between people. You know, it's having, you know, being the chief exec of a local system, a local council, you know, you have these huge bureaucracies with 85,000 people and all the rest of it working for you. And sometimes the interests of bureaucracies and local government can, local systems and even national government can become what you look up to. You manage up to that. Partnership working requires you to look out in different ways. And that's not necessarily where all the incentives or all the structures are aligned to. So it's breaking out, it's giving you, but it does create, I think, this philanthropy relationship does create the chance just to step out of some of the structures, just to step out of some of the traditional ways of working and try new solutions. Because when you look at some of these areas or places, and in the UK and being here in Australia with in this part of Victoria, North Frankston, and then going to Morwell tomorrow, place-based solutions are where it's at. We've kind of learned that you've got to get local. You've got to get into the detail of the weeds of the local community. You know, the capacity is in your local community. You can't just do it to a place. So the bringing those relationships together in ways that you couldn't traditionally do, I think is very exciting. And it does require sometimes new ways of working, which I think the philanthropy relationship helps to drive. I don't know if that gets to it, Sean.
Yeah, no, you actually touch on another point I was hoping to talk about. That's exactly what you were talking about then, the importance of place-based approaches. When we were talking earlier, you mentioned you're starting to see that just about everywhere you go, that seems to be something that's happening around the world. You know, in your extensive experience, you know, having been to different countries and look, you know, in that education space, with education being, you know, the key to the door, as we would say, as our place. Can you talk about, you know, what it takes for a successful place-based initiative?
Well, I think the interesting thing about place is that what I'm learning, and I kind of need to know more about this, and I'd recommend a book by a guy called Robert Putnam, who wrote a book called Our Kids. It's about a town called Clinton, Ohio. And it's all based on this idea that many of the places we'll talk about when we see these examples, they are historically places that had strong identity and purpose, and usually had a kind of industrial base. They were there for a reason. And over time, the world around them has changed, and the industry and the purpose, if you like, has faded, and they're left behind. So I could take you to a dozen post-industrial cities in England where, as our economy has moved and we no longer, you know, have coal mines or build ships or whatever, you're left with Hartlepool or Middlesbrough wondering, well, what are we for? And how do I, and a lot of the talent, you see, what happens is the young people, my Route 1 kids, they go and they leave to go to university and they never come back. And you kind of hollow out the community. So I don't know quite the story of here, but I guess where we're going tomorrow is a story of how power was produced in Australia, and that's no longer happening so much in the where Morwell is. So how do you rebuild purpose? How do you reinvent? Now, what I think know is that the first thing you need to do is create a skills base that mean that someone else wants to go and create employment, a factory or a purpose there, or you create a service there, or so skills education must be part of the agenda. You know, you can't build, you know, you need those skills in those places. So it means that these left behind places are happening in all of the post-industrial sort of world, and we haven't yet really worked out. There are a few examples where it's been almost like miraculous and almost accidental that they've found a way out. but we haven't found consistently how you deal with it. And it's not acceptable, is it, to have a great life in London, for example, and travel on a train for 40 minutes to a bit of the Kent's coast and see a life of absolute misery for people. Doesn't make me safe, doesn't make life happy. We can't have that. So how do we recover these places? I don't think education is the only answer, but it's absolutely one of them. And you need a collaboration of employment, of industry, of housing, of education, of social services, of health, a range of things that are going to have to come together to recover these places. But it's not acceptable to have these spots in our land where people's lives are without promise or hope.
Question? Yep.
Thanks, Kevin. Just a question on how what evidence you would look for from those place-based initiatives that you're talking about to actually take us to scale, and what we might be doing and what we might need to put our attention to.
Really great question. And I'm sort of acknowledging that, you know, the place-based kind of partnership is led by somebody in the room. So I think that there are two or three things. So my experience, I won't draw on this, but I don't know it well enough. But in the UK, we identify these 11 areas, and I was asked by Secretary of State to kind of lead on her work when it was Justine Greening and the evidence champion for each of those areas for her. And I think we learned two or three things that are really important. The first is that often there were lots of people doing really, really good work, but it wasn't aligned or joined up. So the partnerships, the first thing you do is you find structures, and it is a bit boring, governance. You find structures that bring the people around the table together so they begin to kind of work collaboratively. So collaboration is key to this kind of solution. The second is that you definitely need to inject resources more often than not in order to support innovation and activity. You need to see success. You need to rebuild the notion of success and be able to point to each other around the table and says, yes, we can. Look what we've done. These people, these children are capable of this. And here's an example. And often in a place like East London, where I know, you almost need a sort of flagship moment. Let's show you what can be done. So now almost the excuses fall away. Yeah, these are our children and look what they've managed to achieve. So why can't the rest of us do it? That's a bit difficult, but you need those kind of, you need examples of success to demonstrate that it's not the water in the area, if you know what I mean. These can't. Actually, no, they can. But then to your point about indicators, I think it's a slow burner. I think I used the phrase this morning about the inevitability of gradualism. These things are not solved overnight. They've taken a long time often to decline. They're going to take a long time to rebuild. So it's really important you find markers and milestones on the way that you really celebrate hard to build, to change the mindset, often locally, of well, that's how it is here. Of course it will. You know, you need to change the culture of, yes, you know, striving, improving culture. So partnerships, collaboration, good governance is key for me. Quick signs of success, indicators that are really clear about actual child outcomes. If it's the child which I'm involved in, you need to mark those and celebrate them, and you need collectively to acknowledge everybody's contribution to the success. Even if people didn't play a part of it, give them some of the credit, because that builds a partnership. Everyone needs to share in the success, and it's not to hoard it, because that, I think, is building the collaborative culture and capital over time. There are a couple of examples. It's really hard work.
Kevin, we have a question from Jane Bertram. Jane's interested to know, how can we spoke earlier about continuity of learning, continuity of assessment. And Jane's interested to know, how can we move forward on that work, on the continuity of assessment from the early years into school years, that doesn't push down that narrow focus on isolated skills and isolated requirements?
Typical Jane asking me a hard question without answering it, which I think is hysterical, seeing as she knows it better than I do. So some work going on in Australia right now on early learning outcomes. There's a panel, isn't there, meeting of experts, and they're developing a new set of ideas of outcomes. I actually do think that in early education, the journey of access first, quality is coming, and that work that you're doing here, again, celebrating Victoria, the work you've done to find accelerated ways into training, scholarships, all that. I mean, it's brilliant. And then it's logical. The next step is, well, actually, what are the outcomes children are achieving from all of that? And shouldn't we be clear about that? Now, the risk is you get very narrow on them. Interestingly, though, if you take something like language and literacy, we do not know of a better proxy outcome for long-term education attainment. And if anyone's got one, put your hand up. It is still the best proxy outcome we have for long-term attainment. But that's not everything. So we need to be smarter about the non-academic stuff that I've been banging on about. We need to be smarter about ensuring that we have indicators which measure the child's, whether the children are flourishing in our system. And interesting countries as far and wide as, you take, I know you often talk Australia about the sort of Pacific Rim countries. If you take the Singapore education system, which quite rightly everyone lauds, but it's actually quite small, they're really interested in non-academic outcomes of their kids increasingly, because they know that in the workplace, I haven't mentioned this, if you look at the thriving modern workplace, the non-academic skills you hold are every bit as important as your academic skills. So there's a fantastic Danzig study which looked at people who got what you might call great jobs, and they looked at them 10 years later. And yes, high qualifications got you the job, but it was the non-academic skills you had which predicted who really thrived in work and succeeded in the company. So the future belongs, if you like, to people loving mathematicians. You need the skills, but you also need to have really highly developed social and emotional skills if you're going to thrive at work. And maths at Merit is the highest value subject at the moment in the employment market around the world.
Thanks. So Kevin, just building on what makes for success, leadership is clearly something that is critical to our work at our place and critical to any organisation. So I'm curious how you define leadership. And then can you give us some stories or examples of where you've seen leadership play a role in bringing about change and bringing about innovation?
So, how many courses have we been on educational leadership? It's a kind of industry, isn't it, of the work, and of course it is, because it really, really matters. You rarely go to a really great education establishment that just happens to be run by a really poor leader, and it matters that we invest in leadership. And I reckon what we've learned is that leadership is it is learnable. There's a lot you can learn. It's not just born. And increasingly we're learning that leadership is more than just kind of like, how can I say it? There was a bit of time when people were buying books at airports and applying kind of industrial management leadership speak to education. And I think we've begun to get a bit more confident about the insights and I think goes to the evidence bit, the insights and knowledge we have about effective leadership. If you take the work of someone like Vivian Robinson, for example, out of New Zealand, I really like, and the work that's been done here in Victoria at the Bastow Institute, there's some really good thinking about the characteristics of effective leadership. And I like the fact that we're moving beyond it being a sort of blueprint, and actually authentic leadership is really important to me. Who you are is brought to it. and that you reveal yourself. So the combination of your knowledge, your skills, your passion, and of course in education for me, the most important word after love is trust. And in trust, in assured trust, leaders are followed because they are people who have values you believe in. They will have your back on a street fight, and they know what they're talking about. They have knowledge. I have very little time now for leaders in education who aren't mindful of the evidence. I think it's inexcusable. And I think it's inexcusable to be a compliant leader. I think you need you be a leader who is about building professional trust amongst your community, because the knowledge is there, and we have. So I'm not answering your question succinctly because it's too difficult to answer in a few throwaway words, but I do think authentic, informed leadership to me are important. Now, I know, going to the stories, that I haven't always been like that. And I don't think you always need to be quite like that. So just a caveat. When I've gone into schools that are really, really failing, and I've done turnaround work, I don't in those schools necessarily think about professional trust and the long way round initially. I go in and say, in my view, in my experience, and from the evidence, there are 6 systems that must be in place, and we will have those systems in place in this school. And there is no discussion about that. So it's leadership that's adaptive. It's leadership that says in certain contexts you behave in different ways, but it's not where I want to be. And I would say that, and I'm doing it like that for now for this reason. We're going to get here. So it's transparent leadership. It's kind of constant sort of dialogue. But there are people in the room that have done more of this than I have, that have turned around more schools than I have, that have led more schools than I have, and they probably have their own and led more early year settings, and we need to honour that's the kind of leadership. And by the way, on early years, I don't think we've invested yet enough in an understanding of effective leadership. I think we're beginning to do that work. I know that my colleague Iram is doing that work at Oxford to really begin to understand the character. We've done a lot in schools. We haven't really classically. We haven't done the same level of thinking in early years yet. And yet, when you look at the early years leader, they usually have relationships, deep relationships with families. They're managing an array of kind of activities. They're usually paid a lot less for what they're doing. And yet we are...
There you go. I think it's on now.
high stakes moment.
Okay, we have...
So you left some people hanging with the 6 systems that you put in place in turnaround schools.
Okay, I've got to try to remember all of them. But they won't surprise you, the kind of things. So I've mentioned already about behaviour and habits, tracking and assessment, clarity and consistency of the curriculum, the kind of rhythm and ritual of the school day for me had to be kind of, everyone had to kind of address and attend to that. Respectful relationships with parents was built in how we would talk to and be with our parents. And then there was some, and I haven't got quite the words, I can't remember quite the words, but there's something about the way that, personally, the way that we do things here. So, for example, you will not shout as a teacher in my school, in our school. So you've got the ways we do things here, just personal kind of responsibilities and obligations. So there's some of the things for me that need to be in place in order to, that aren't really negotiable.
Oh, great.
I'm glad I wore my sneakers.
Thank you. Hi, thanks, Kevin. I turn my head back to the start of the conversation about COVID recovery and thinking about our parents and carers and our children, noting the things that you've said, and then other things that we're learning about mental health and isolation and things that have the experience that they've had. So could you tell us a bit more, any other examples around that, building parents' confidence in parenting, even though we don't want to say to them, you need parenting skills, that's important to us, but we might see signs of it. Or parents in confidence in their children's education, or supporting their children where they have special needs of some kind.
Asking the question from the perspective of, give it a bit more, sorry.
I think most of it is about parent confidence. So you gave the example about the paying the parents and what you learnt from parents not necessarily engaging with the school, what they were trying to, or engaging with learning. So that sparked real interest with me, because we see different examples of that about parent confidence. Thanks.
Thank you. In the school down the road this lunchtime, there, as you go in the foyer, what was the name of the second school? Sorry, Aldcourt. As you go in the foyer, there's a table, and on the table are boxes full of food that parents can go and take some food if they need it, and they take it back. I kind of, this idea that we reach further into people's lives, you know, I don't know if this is true in Australia. When I first started teaching, there used to be lines on the playground saying parents not beyond this point, kind of thing. So this idea that it's a partnership, that we're reaching into your life, that we're in this together, kind of thing. So it's the balance between engaging and involving parents. So at one point, parent engagement moved into this. We sent a list out of things they should do. Tick this box when you've read with your child. You got this list of kind of things you had to do, and I think we've moved increasingly into trying to forge really strong relationships, so we understand where our parents are at, what their lives, and how can we demonstrate that we are supporting you and your family. So this is, I think, where early years is really interesting, in that the relationships. This is a bit. Throwaway, but I think it might be true. On average, parents are very engaged, more engaged the younger the child with the education establishment. And equally, as the children get older and they face really, really difficult, important life choices, we have our weaker relationships with parents. So there's kind of a delicious irony about that. But how do we maintain and build on those relationships? And I think it's where are we when it gets difficult? How are we willing to lean in? Now, you can't do this as well as, and that's why I think the movement to have in some schools, I know in Australia where you have the additional resources for serving children with low income, and we have what's called the pupil premium in England. And part of my job was to sort of create, if you like, the sort of evidence base that schools could draw on to make decisions about how they want to spend that money. Parental involvement, parental engagement. Some people would actually have someone they employed to become the parental liaison officer, someone who could speak some of the languages, who would get involved. And you'd find them leaning into people's lives in all sorts of ways. Is that really our job? Well, yes, it is, because we want that parent to be engaged with us. Because again, what the evidence is, it's not that the parent can do the maths homework. It's the parent constantly demonstrates to the child that this is important work. And so it's the value piece. So I think it's about relationships again. It's about trust. It's about involving but not overly demanding. And I think it's about knowing your parents. One good example, while you on examples, one of the jobs when I was, again, going back to Hamlets, which is kind of runs through my veins really, still as a place. If you don't know, it's the most amazing bit of London. It's East London, basically from the Tower north up to Victoria Park, and then from the City of London west all the way through Canary Wharf. London's most deprived community, about 300,000 people. London's youngest community, and where 70% of the kids arrive at school speaking English as one of the languages they speak. And one of the issues we faced was we had the highest level of long-term absence in the country. So Bangladeshi children going back to Bangladesh for a family event, sadly a funeral or a wedding or something, and they'd go for 2 or 3 months. And became a bit of a nightmare. So we tried everything. And then we decided to work with the grain of the community. And by the way, that borough that used to have the lowest education results in England is now in the top 20% consistently in every year performance in terms of kids' outcomes. because we work with the grain of the community. So on absence, we ended up working with the East London Mosque, which on a Good Friday can have 30,000 people, when you think about engagement, attend. We ended up with the East London Mosque saying that, showing the data of what happened when you went away from school for more than a month. And they went, we didn't know this. They took it on as a responsibility. We entered a sort of community contract with them. They started doing all the work on getting people, and we then, our long-term absence dropped dramatically to be one of the lowest. So I think part of it is, when you work with parents, ask yourselves, what are the structures and groups and community groups that parents really trust? Yes, there's us, but then there are faith groups, there are community groups, there are other structures. Unfortunately, in some communities, those structures have become very, very fragile. In that community, the mosque was still really important. But the white working class community of East London, it's difficult finding the structures that they now connect with. So sometimes school is the best structure in people's lives. So, but working within structures as well with our families and communities as well is a part of the solution for me.
Okay, I think we're out of questions. So I just really would like to thank you, Kevin, again for making the time today. And I mean, it's been we've covered a range of quite diverse topics, but all very relevant to the work that many of us are involved in. And I think we'll all be richer for the conversation. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you, everyone.
And I think that concludes our event. So thanks to all those that joined us online. Thank you very much.